All right, today we're tackling one of the biggest questions in Christianity. It's a real chicken and the egg puzzle that has shaped 2,000 years of history. It's all about ultimate authority. And believe me, the answer changes everything. So let's just get right into it. Which actually came first? The church, the community of believers, or the Bible, the book we all know today? It seems pretty simple on the surface, but your answer to that question really determines where you look for the final word. So let's unpack the argument laid out in our source material. Okay, to really get to the bottom of this, we've got to start with the core argument being presented. This really sets the stage for everything else that's going to follow. All right, let's dive in. The position presented in our source is crystal clear. The church came before the Bible, specifically before the New Testament. The whole idea is that a living, breathing, teaching community of faith was up and running for decades, even centuries, before the book that would become its scripture was even fully written, let alone put together. And that leads us right to our first major piece of evidence, the historical timeline. If the church really did come first, you'd expect to see a gap, right? A gap between its founding and the creation of the Bible. And as we're about to see, that gap is, well, it's pretty significant. So check this out, because this slide really puts it all into perspective. The church kicks off around 33 AD, but the very first books of the New Testament, they don't even get written until almost 20 years later, around 51 AD. But here's the kicker. The official list of which books actually belong in the Bible, what's called the canon, wasn't formally settled until 397 AD. We're talking about a gap of over 350 years. So, what on earth did that mean for the first few generations of Christians? Well, it means they didn't have a New Testament to carry around and read. Think about it. Early martyrs like St. Stephen died for their faith without ever seeing a completed Bible. The faith was lived, it was taught, and it spread entirely by word of mouth and community practice. Our source calls this concept sacred tradition. So what is sacred tradition exactly? Well, according to this view, it's the total package of faith, handed down from Jesus to the apostles. It's not just what they wrote down, it's also everything they preached and taught out loud. It's seen less as something separate from the Bible and more like the living stream of faith that the Bible itself flowed out of. And the argument is that the Bible itself actually points to this reality. In this letter, St. Paul doesn't say, hey, only listen to what I write down. Nope. He explicitly tells them to hold on to the traditions they got from him in two ways. By word of mouth, so his preaching, and by letter. This verse is held up as major evidence for a dual authority of both spoken and written teaching in the early church. Okay, so if a teaching church existed before the Bible, the next logical question is, which one was it? Is it still around? Our source material says yes, and it makes the case that this original community can be identified through a direct, unbroken line. So according to the source, the argument for identifying that first church as the Catholic Church rests on three main pillars. First, an unbroken line of authority from the apostles. Second, the special authority given to St. Peter. And third, a consistent set of beliefs that were practiced right from the get-go. First up, apostolic succession. This is the idea that the teaching authority Jesus gave his 12 apostles didn't just vanish when they died. Instead, it was passed on, like a torch from one person to the next, from apostle to bishop, in an unbroken chain that, it's argued, continues all the way to today. It points to a visible, structured church. And the group that holds this authority, it's called the magisterium. You can think of it as the official teaching office of the Catholic Church, basically the bishops working together with the Pope. Their job, in this view, is to guard and correctly interpret that sacred tradition we were just talking about. Now for that second pillar, Petrine primacy, or the primacy of Peter. This verse right here is absolutely central to the Catholic claim. Jesus singles out Peter, whose name literally means rock, and says he's the foundation for the entire church. This is seen as giving Peter and the popes who came after him a unique role of leadership. And the final pillar is all about consistent beliefs. The source argues that core Catholic doctrines weren't just made up centuries later. Instead, it points to writings from the 1st and 2nd centuries that seem to talk about things like the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the idea that baptism saves you, and a clear church structure. Heck, the name Catholic Church itself first shows up in writing around the year 110 AD. Now, obviously, this is a huge topic, and the church first model isn't the only game in town, not by a long shot. So let's flip a coin and look at the major counter-arguments and see how our source material responds to them.
The biggest counter-argument, and really a cornerstone of the Protestant Reformation, is a principle called sola scriptura.
Sola scriptura is just Latin for by scripture alone, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the belief that the Bible is the one and only infallible source of authority for Christians. In this view, any church tradition or teaching has to be judged against what's written in the Bible. The book is the final umpire.
So here's where the debate gets really interesting. Proponents of sola scriptura will point to verses like 2 Timothy 3:16, which says Scripture is useful for making a person of God complete. But the rebuttal from our source is this. The idea of sola scriptura itself, the doctrine that the Bible is the only authority, is not actually taught anywhere in the Bible. The argument, essentially, is that it's a tradition from outside the Bible that's being used to say only the Bible has authority.
Okay, the second major counter-argument goes something like this. Even if Jesus did start a visible church, that church went off the rails and fell away from the true faith. You might hear this called the Great Apostasy Theory. The argument here is that a lot of these Catholic doctrines were just invented centuries later. But the source's rebuttal really zeroes in on the timeline. It says, hold on, there's just not enough time for this huge secret corruption to have happened. We have writings from people like Polycarp, who was a student of the Apostle John himself, and he was already defending the very doctrines that are supposedly later inventions.
So, after going through the timeline, the arguments, the counter-arguments, what's the big takeaway here? Why are we still talking about this thousands of years later? Why does it matter? Well, it matters because your starting point, church first or Bible first, creates two completely different ways of being a Christian. If you start with the Bible alone, authority is in the text. If you start with the church, authority is in the institution that says it produced, protected, and has the power to interpret that text. It's a fork in the road that leads to two very different places. And that leaves us right here, with the question at the very heart of this whole thing. Is the ultimate authority found in a book, or is it found in the institution that says it wrote, compiled, and protected that very book? It's a question about origins, but it defines the present for billions of people all over the world.